So whatever it is.
It's going to go. It's going to go.
Continual notes without a single break in.
And I almost lost it there, but easy.
From the British pop revolution of the 1960s emerged an entirely new breed of musician, a post-Beatles, post-psychedelic generation that saw a future of limitless possibilities. It was time for pop music to move beyond the 3-minute love song and chart success. With little or no concern for fame, fortune, or the audience, they plundered every musical form on an adventure into uncharted territory in search of the lost chord. This is the story of that generation of new bands. Yes, King Crimson, Genesis, ELP, Jethro Tull, and many more, from the land that time forgot, the glory days of Prog Britannia. In 1967, pop music, like the world it inhabited, was about to explode. In London, the British beat boom fused with American pop in a blaze of invention that would ransack jazz, folk, and anything else it could find in the many basement clubs of the city.
I do think there are periods which are golden age. You know, the stars are aligned and whatever is happening that produces a lot of creativity.
Where I was at college, it was like a snapshot of music at the time. The agri-bot people, like the Beatles. The side I was on was blues upstairs, and in the cellar, Bob Dylan. And then you had the modern jazz guys and the classical guys.
Otis Redding and Sam and Dave and Booker T and the MGs came over, and you suddenly realise that, you know, it's game up. You can't pretend to be them anymore when they're actually here. There was some white music that even black musicians were listening to. For example, Jimi Hendrix was listening very hard to Bob Dylan, you know. There was stuff going on.
It's the time of the season.
And there was, you know, huge social changes and huge chemical changes going on. There was something definitely in the water.
I mean, timing's everything. I mean, the smartest thing I did was get born in 1949. Brilliant, brilliant. Because at 18, you're in 1968. You know, Europe's aflame, the Paris riots, you know. Perfect.
I was in the States in '68, and there were 3 major assassinations while we were there. A few Kennedys and an Andy Warhol or 2, and, you know, it's all happening.
It was all happening, but much of the music only reached eager young British ears courtesy of outlaws, offshore pirate radio stations broadcasting illegally to a nation still dominated by something called the BBC Light Programme.
You know, it was unreachable. It felt like you were tuning into another planet, you know, contacting the aliens. It was coming from another world. You can only reach it, you know, on little transistor radios, late at night.
Then, in May 1967, a song that fused Bach with Percy Sledge via Bob Dylan and Geoffrey Chaucer was heard leaving for the coast. A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum.
I wouldn't be exaggerating when I said that the world was waiting for that.
We skip the light fandango, turns cartwheels across the floor.
The Beatles and the beat boom had been going for certainly 3 or 4 years. It was getting a little bit tired.
The crowd called out for more.
I wanted to do something, but I didn't want it to be like anything else, because we've had it all. This, I've never heard this before, really. That's what you think to yourself. Therefore, I like this.
When we call out for love, dream, the way to
And so it was that later, only 2 weeks later, as the miller told his tale, the Beatles released an album that was a concept, a world unto itself.
Singles, you know, Cream, Strange Brew, Pink Floyd, Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, and Procol Harum, Whiter Shade of Pale. All of these records, you know, they were amazing, creative, interesting singles, and they also were incredibly commercially successful. So I mean, the bands were getting, at that moment, were getting the best of both worlds. It was Sgt. Pepper and the creative, you know, amazement of Sgt. Pepper that really convinced everybody that you can extend ideas onto an album, you can make concept albums. In fact, with the album, you can do almost exactly whatever you want.
It was a strange mixture of almost musical and totally otherworld music, you know. That was the wonderful thing about it. It bridged a gap between, you know, the real world and this other world. And the other thing, it was all totally new. You know, you never heard anything like that before.
It's more fun in the record if there's a few sounds that you don't really know what they are, and really they're just instruments, only something happens on here, you know. I couldn't tell you what, because we have a special man who sits here and goes like this. And the guitar turns into a piano or something, you know. And then you may say, why don't you use a piano? Because the piano sounds like a guitar.
If you look at the leap in terms of musical vocabulary and sophistication between the first Beatles album and Sgt. Pepper, which is like 5 years, kind of everything that could be done with that form has already been done in a way in those 5 years. Where else can you take it except to try and make it more and more sophisticated and more musically interesting, or just for rock music to kind of go on repeating itself and regurgitating itself?
If you like, there's a lot of classical music I liked.
I was always frightened of classical music, and I never wanted to listen to it because it was Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and some big words like that, and Schoenberg.
I think a lot of people started to appreciate many other genres.
Pop music is the classical music of now.
Probably the Beatles had been listening to the same stuff, smoked the same cannabis, you know, now and again.
A lot of people were smoking on the quiet, and they actually got furious when the hippies came on, because suddenly there was a lot of notice being taken out, whereas they'd been quietly, you know, enjoying themselves for a long time.
This was the era when, you know, if you wanted to try something, you could, you know, you knew a mate who had some hashish, or you knew a mate who had some LSD, you know, but you had to be careful. If you were very cautious and took very little of these things, you could meddle and not lose your mind and end up in hospital.
Cannabis was a stimulant, and it did enable you to hear a lot more in the music. I mean, it was there, you weren't imagining it, it was in there, but you concentrated more on listening to it.
What came from that was the ability for people who would normally copy American music suddenly wanted to express themselves. And so you had the strange thing at that time that almost every band had a unique sound. Nobody sounded quite like anyone else.
Dynamic explosions in my brain, shatter me across the brain, falling from a yellow sky.
I moved across to what was really a new movement in music, which was the psychedelia period. And that was Arthur Brown, the crazy world of Arthur Brown. I mean, we didn't know what it was, and we were in it. What was it?
It was pretty confrontational, for that time shocking.
Arthur's concept was basically about the beginning of time, the beginning of life.
I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you.
The original for the makeup was the Death Mask, which goes back right through English history and further than that.
It was kind of deep, really. It was real, you know.
Sometimes the bowl would be filled with petrol, and then the roadie would stand there throwing matches good distance away until one landed in there and we'd go...
The British beat boom had been a predominantly northern or working class phenomenon. But the architects of progressive rock were escapees from entirely different backgrounds.
I suppose for a rock and roller, my education was completely wrong. My mum and dad, I mean, literally did go without food to send me to piano lessons. I never found that out till many, many years on, and I went there when I was 5, and I loved it.
My family had a varied taste in music, and they were very opinionated about it. Of course, I like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and they were going, nonsense, you won't even know who these people are next year. One day I was in this attic, and I put on this Vivaldi record or something, it was Four Seasons or something, and I just flipped. I mean, I just went, this is fantastic stuff.
Studied Stravinsky's Dumbarton Oaks Concerto, did a lot of church music, sang in choirs. At the same time as being obsessively interested in the Shadows.
Went to the Guildhall, went to the Royal Academy, had lots of private tuition, but never really wanted to be in an orchestra, or a jazz group for that matter. I wanted to be a rock drummer.
I got a scholarship to the Royal College of Music, and I went there and I left after a year and a half. I thought, this is nuts, this whole thing. I mean, the college were really, really anti any form of music if it wasn't serious classical music.
They would either have become classical musicians, I suppose, because a lot of them had classical training to grade, whatever it is, or they would have become jazzers. But the jazz scene in Britain was never that exciting. It was always such hard work.
In 66, 67, jazz was in a bad place. Jazz was free jazz. It was squeaky bum jazz, you know, kind of squeaking away. And any red-blooded drummer, age 17 at that time, would have wanted to play with Jimi Hendrix rather than the spontaneous music ensemble.
But what made pop so attractive to some inexperienced young musicians were the girls.
There's this whole other half of the human race, and like it says in Some Like It Hot, I tell you, it's a whole different sex. There was girls. Where were they? They were in cafes. What were they doing? Sitting there. What did they had chalk white pink lipstick on. And I thought, I don't quite know what they're for or what you meant to do in them, but I always thought, you know, there's something great about this lot. You couldn't talk to them, but what you could do is put on a Little Richard record on the jukebox, and then it would unify the room. You couldn't put on Bartok violin concerto. That wouldn't have impressed anybody. It wouldn't have unified the room. Wouldn't have got everybody tapping their feet.
But the classical tradition had gripped a generation of rock and rollers determined to show that pop music could also be profound and grown up. In The Winter of Love, Procol Harum scored another first when they recorded an 18-minute suite in Held 'Twas in I for their album Shine On Brightly. The search for meaning and significance was on.
I said, I think we should do like a great work. That's what I called it. In fact, it was called O Magnum Harum for a while. Started off at the beginning of the universe, that we did, and ended in heaven. And all the trials and tribulations that come in between, with a bit of sitar chucked in. Somebody had to do it, I suppose. You know, if it hadn't have been Procol Harum at that point, it would have been somebody, 4 weeks later.
now we can actually write music. And if we're going to write music, the model is classical music, and classical music has extended forms, sonatas, symphonies. So we're going to do structures and pieces that last a long time, that try and give us that credibility musically.
The Nice, originally P.P. Arnold's backing band, set the controls for the heart of classical music, jazz, and the modern stage musical on their maiden voyage into progressive rock. Frontman Keith Emerson was the Hendrix of the Hammond organ, making his instrument scream and sigh in dazzling displays of technical virtuosity and crazed physicality. Their first unlikely hit was a 7-minute version of Leonard Bernstein's America from West Side Story, transformed into an instrumental prog rock protest song. Progressive music didn't only come from the big cities. Welcome to Canterbury, the posh cathedral town that seeded those musicians who would in time grow into Soft Machine, Caravan, Hatfield and the North, and Matching Mole, all stemming from a little-known local group called the Wild Flowers.
The Wild Flowers didn't do loads of gigs. Probably only about one a fortnight, maybe one a week, because we weren't very popular. Those lads were very much into Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie. We tried to do sort of danceable versions of that kind of music, you see, just to be different and awkward.
I like me, I like you, and the things that we do. Though my mouth love you too.
I don't like it if people think, you know, that we thought that sort of clever grammar schooly people came in and thought we were doing something better than just mere pop. We were awestruck by pop music, by the magnificence of Beatles, of Motown, and really we just wanted to participate in it, but getting our little groups together, our own dialects of other stuff we picked up crept into what we did. You know, I'm playing beat drums and I'm trying to sound like a rhythm and blues drummer, but I have been listening to all these sophisticated jazz drummers, and I was sort of cluttered with stuff. You can't sit and pretend you haven't heard Elvin Jones if you have,
Soft Machine was the first band to emerge from the Wild Flowers. They headed for London's newly established underground clubs, playing with groups such as Arthur Brown and Pink Floyd at Middle-earth and UFO.
In that club you got everything from vaudeville to rock to jazz to electronics to pure percussion to theatre to poetry to dance to naked people wandering around.
That was what we all gravitated towards, UFO and Middle-earth. That was the culture that defined us.
But all these sort of stoned people listening to music played by stoned bands, and as long as everybody was stoned, everybody thought it was really good. We hadn't really got enough tunes to just do songs. So we thought, I remember, what do you do about that? I know. What did jazz musicians do? They improvise. So you just pick a couple of chords in there and just keep going on them. And so tunes become 10-minute events. This is not because we've all become virtuosos, it's not in our case. It's because we haven't got enough tunes to stretch 1.5 hours. Organist Mike Ratledge was older than us, taller, and his father had been headmaster and who had an Oxford degree, so therefore assumed immediate seniority.
Well, there's the fuzz box, which sounds like this.
Well, if once he puts his fuzz on, you had to keep playing. You couldn't take your hand off because it would start feeding back. So he developed a solo style of absolutely continual notes without a single break in it. So we could do these sort of trance-like things without, you know, when get some sound going on, ages and ages, without a single pause.
Just round the corner from UFO, the more established Marquee Club was already showcasing bands that would become the virtuoso kings of progressive rock, like Jethro Tull, and Yes, fronted by vocalist John Anderson.
I went to see Yes with 30 other people at the Marquee one night, and the guy next to me said, "You know, they're looking for a drummer." And I met John, introduced myself. He said, "Oh yeah, man, yeah, give us a call, come back next Tuesday, we'll give you an audition." And I never called, you know, and I often wonder if I'd have called, what would have happened to my life?
Life in Yes for jazz drummer Bill Bruford was like this.
The group started as a cover band, like most groups do. You start playing Beatles tunes and a couple of tunes by The Fifth Dimension, and like you would. And then we got bored and we'd extend a section. So, well, it's quite good up to here, but let's stick in another bit here where it goes like rhythm and blues. All right, you know, we stick that in. And then the thing would get longer and longer, until eventually somebody inevitably said, well, let's like make one up ourselves. John was a very keen listener, an absorber of music, a bit like blotting paper, you know, he absorbed music.
Time like gold springs
and was mad keen on Sibelius and TV themes. He'd start singing things. "John, this is the theme to Bonanza," and he said, "Oh, never mind, stick it in," you know.
Yes never said no. They stitched movie soundtracks to folk music, to modern jazz, to classical music, to TV themes, pop music.
And the only people we didn't concern ourselves with, I think, at all was the audience.
Step out in the night when you're lonely, listening for the sound city ears don't hear.
If you couldn't make the London clubs, couldn't find progressive rock albums in the shops, and rarely heard it on the radio, you could, by the end of the 60s, see every band in one glorious drug and rain-drenched experience at a pop festival near you. This was the first golden age of the British Music Festival, a new community in which no one was more welcome than the progressive rock group.
Everybody had a festival. But you went along and played, heard all different types of band, and people would listen to a jazz-orientated band, you know, a hard rock band, a sort of a dance-type band, and they would sit there and they'd listen to the lot.
Certainly, the outdoor live music experience was generally free. It always seemed like it was a sunny day. The weather was gorgeous, everybody was smiling and happy and all of that. It was a very sort of hippie thing.
It was really music. It really was music. It wasn't any other reason. Yeah, people got a bit smashed and, you know, sort of bonked in the open air. That's just the road crew.
Quaint Suffolk seaside town of Aldborough, now home to Pete Sinfield, original lyricist for the intimidating new band he inadvertently named King Crimson.
I mean, we had an ethos in Crimson. I'm sure people like Gentle Giant and other bands, we just refused to play anything that sounded anything like a Tin Pan Alley pop song. So if it sounded at all popular, it was out. So it had to be complicated. It had to be more expensive chords. It had to have strange influences. If it sounded like too simple, we would make it more complicated. We'd play it on 7/8 or 5/8 just to show off.
For the court of the Crimson.
Crimson's first big show-off opportunity came in July 1969 when they supported the Rolling Stones in Hyde Park, unleashing their unique, highly rehearsed sound on a totally unprepared audience.
They played Schizoid Man particularly well on that day. They really steamed. It was a monster. We've played Mars or Schizoid Man or something were our heavier pieces, and there was a silence at the end, and nobody knew whether to clap or not. That was good. And then they would go. That was the sort of stuff we liked. We really liked shocking people.
Unbelievable. We were scared to death. Nobody knew that rock musicians could play like that. To execute rapid passages very definitely loud. Then exactly the same passage, everybody playing the unison thing, but very, very quiet. I mean, this was scary. This was the best group in the world.
Mike Giles one night was playing cymbals, playing Mothers in Birmingham. He ended up playing the cymbals like this. So there was no noise at all. And he just poised and didn't do anything. And we thought, wow, I was thinking... And Fripp panicked and took off his boot and started banging the stage with his boot because he couldn't stand the tension. The amount of ego and power and experience that went into that first album was extraordinary. Maybe that's inherent in that, and that strength was also the seeds of its destruction.
The shock and awe that both defined and deified King Crimson were completely absent from the whimsical, slightly stoned sound still emanating from Canterbury. The remaining Wildflowers now took the road out of town as a band called Caravan.
When half of the Wildflowers as such went off and formed Soft Machine and managed to get a record deal, we thought that perhaps we could do the same. So we were very much like looking to see how they were doing and trying to do the same thing ourselves.
I suppose with the Canterbury scene you have progressive music at its most melodic. It's to do with these people being able to write quite good tunes, being in contact, I think, with a kind of British melodic tradition, which maybe has to do more with 20th century classical music than with pop music. You know, you hear distant echoes of Vaughan Williams and Britain and that kind of thing.
Sitting in my treetop world, doing nothing at all.
Certainly the surrounding countryside and what have you, we seem to get a bit of inspiration from all that, sitting about in the sunshine, making up bits of music.
And they need all you want.
Living off girlfriends, you know. Great fun.
But join me time if you please.
Court jesters, crimson kings, lost souls, and magic men. This was a broad church, a very English music, infused with childhood fantasies and the quirkiness of a small island race.
Spike Milligan, Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll, stuff like that. And we had our own kind of built-in popular surrealism right from the humorous poets and writers of the late 19th, early 20th century. Long before they invented surrealism, actually, on the continent. We had Lewis Carroll.
At that time, we were making quite a large effort to be English. Probably why we didn't go down too well in Germany whenever we went there.
Charterhouse Public School. A group of young scholars, inspired by the ambitious compositions of Procol Harum and King Crimson, embraced this new, mature pop music as a way of dodging the professions for which they'd been groomed.
We found it a bit of a tag over us, public school boys. What do they do? What do they know about music? Where's their pain, sort of thing?
We were in a school that was designing kind of to people go out to go into the sort of civil service. You often talk about sort of getting into music being an escape from kind of poverty and stuff, which perhaps it was for a certain kind of people back in the late 50s and early 60s and stuff. For us, it was a kind of an escape from a totally sort of predetermined career choice, if you like.
I was banned from playing the guitar at my entire time at Charterhouse. I don't quite know why. I think they saw the guitar as a symbol of the revolution. And I was going to start it off in my house with my guitar, so I was always, under the thumb of my housemaster for that reason.
They wanted to be songwriters, but bands were now playing their own material, so they formed their own band, called it Genesis, and did what every other group now seemed to be doing: retreated to the country to get their heads together.
There was a phrase, getting together in the country, man. But actually I think being removed from the business was actually really quite important for us. The time at Christmas Cottage was when we first sort of became a band and started writing, I think, with our own sound.
It's what came naturally to us, really. We were kind of embedded in sort of English and also European sort of classical traditions as well, but also in terms of, I think a lot of the lyrical stuff we would take from English things. We were influenced by sort of T.S. Eliot and fairy stories and stuff like that.
People forget there weren't that many bands in those days. It was like a blank canvas. So as long as you were half decent and had a bit of a sound and were good live, you had a bit of a chance as a career,
We like audiences that sit down and listen to the music rather than get drunk and pick out girls. And we like audiences that sit down and listen.
While Genesis focused on songwriting, other bands were mastering their instruments and finding new ones. Technical virtuosity was fast becoming the essential protein in progressive rock's DNA.
I just don't believe that a drummer should just keep time. Because if you want time, buy a metronome, don't come and speak to me, I think music, you make it for yourself. If the chap next door likes it, isn't that fantastic?
I do think self-indulgence is a good thing in art, because if you're trying to please other people all the time, you just stick to the same model all the time. And nobody hears anything new, so nobody expects anything new. It's like that.
You play a note and you project it out. Even if it's one note, you can either go dun, dun. It's more than just playing the instrument.
It's not cool these days to play your instrument. It's the jangly guitar music. It's jangly. That's what you do. But to actually play a solo, something nice, something that speaks, something that gives you a little kind of emotion or a little buzz or makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I don't think that's not cool. That's not part of this age.
But this was the dawning of the age of the highly accomplished player, the name musician. In 1970, Crimson man Greg Lake, plus Nice man Keith Emerson, plus Crazy World man Carl Palmer, equalled bass, keyboards and drums, equalled prog rock's first supergroup, equalled ELP.
We weren't a rock band, we weren't a blues band. Emerson, Lake and Palmer was a kind of, was a European group that played classical adaptations. Yes, we could rock out, but we didn't hang our hat on being a rock band. In actual fact, it really was a thoroughbred musical statement we were making. You need the playing expertise so your colleagues know that you are the bee's knees, but just give them some entertainment as well, and that's what it's all about. That's my philosophy. Call it show business, actually. Somebody jumping over their organ or sticking in knives to hold down a fifth or a fourth chord musically is valid. Visually it's right on it, and it is rock and roll.
ELP's technical expertise and crowd-pleasing antics elevated musicianship and ticket sales to new heights. Progressive rock popped its head out of the underground and glimpsed not only show business, but big business. Progressive rock wizard Rick Wakeman was amazed when he first saw what Yes were now up to with their psychedelic guitarist Steve Howe.
Everything that happened in the 70s, this is it, was to do with psychedelia, you see. Psychedelia may have quit, you know, as a fashion in 1968, but when I had joined Yes, I was still a psychedelic guitarist in my mind. I would not play blues cliches for love nor money.
I was just bowled over because everything was wrong. Bill Bruford had the most incredible, unusual tuning of the kit, and they'd mic'd it up. Nobody mic'd it up then, and it was the most fantastic drum sound I'd ever heard.
There were funk elements, there were classical elements, you know, there'd be a freeze section or some sort of psychedelic vamp or a funk thing, because we like Sly and the Family Stone, so we need some of that.
Chris Squire, most bass players tried to get as low as they could to make your trousers flat. Chris wiped out all the middle and had all the treble turned up and used a Rickenbacker where everybody else was using Fenders. Thought, that's outrageous. And then Steve Howe, when everybody else was using like big stacks of everything, had a little Fender Twin, you know, and had a Gibson semi-acoustic.
I played any kind of guitar that you could think of that I liked. So I went on to mandolin, steel, and all the kinds of, you know, 6, 12, Spanish.
What? What's going? And then, of course, at those times, every lead singer was 6'6", long, greasy black hair. You could smell them from the back row. And on comes this little fella who's got an alto voice.
Wakeman wanted in. But when he got the call, it wasn't an easy decision.
On the same day that Yes asked me to join, David Bowie asked me to form Spiders from Mars with Mick Ronson, which was, when I look back, I mean, that's one hell of a choice.
There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and...
Progressive music wasn't the only gig in town. Top of the Pops, regarded as a total sellout by any self-respecting prog rocker, was by now home to artists like Bowie, Roxy Music and T-Rex, bands still making singles hits, and Girls Dance. For Robert Wyatt, the Soft Machine party was all but over. The band had matured into a jazz fusion quartet with little sympathy for his pop sensibilities. Goodbye the UFO Club. Hallowed the Albert Hall.
You know, very respected and so on, but nobody was dancing anymore, and I sort of thought, oh, you know, I never really quite made it as a proper pop musician. We thought we were a pop band. It's just that, you know, it just came. I always try to make normal records. They just don't come out like that. We could have made a really good pop LP and, you know, been in the charts and be in those films about the 60s, and we blew it.
Wyatt was eventually sacked from his own group.
I mean, I resented it for a while, you know, and when I got cross, I think I used to feel about Soft Machine a bit way Palestinians feel about Jerusalem, you know, I think. This one was mine.
Without Wyatt, Soft Machine moved into purely instrumental compositions, avoiding the problems of lyrics. My Baby Done Left Me never did work with complex musical structures. His music didn't want the blues, it needed fantasy and myth. Cupid meets Psyche, not boy meets girl.
We hadn't really experienced much outside education. So I suppose in a way that's partly why we wrote more about, I suppose, fantasy lyrics, different situations about life rather than boy-girl things.
I was come from a sort of, you know, public school background, very self-conscious, could never have expressed anything like that in a song in those days. So it was much easier to go back to kind of Greek myths and write things like that, you know. So we plundered sort of Ovid and anybody else we could find, and we're all a bit the same, really.
There was an audience of newly educated sort of university students who were just crying out for something that they've read in science fiction, and they wanted a sort of musical version of that. And of course there was The Lord of the Rings, and there was Merlin Peake and Corman Gas, and people wanted that in their music.
Ambitious music demanded ambitious presentation. What began with Sgt. Pepper now became the glorious norm. Albums adorned with lyrics, paintings, cutouts, pop-ups and pull-outs. The gatefold sleeve opened like a window onto brave new worlds and provided the perfect prop on which to roll a joint.
I think the album cover, the artwork, and a vinyl, when you bought that, that was a piece you could hold it, you could look at it, you could tell that it was big, you know. When this suddenly went down to the jewel case, to the CD, oh, you know, you couldn't have the detail, you know, because it was too small, you know, I needed one for each eye, you know.
Oh, it's hard not to start sounding like, you know, in my day, the gatefold sleeve, but it's changed now, you know, music is now, it's not something that people hold the article.
It was a whole event of getting an album, getting your album home, putting it on, reading the bits and pieces, learning a bit about it. It was absolutely fantastic. And we lost that. And when we lost that, we lost an awful lot.
So welcome back to Days of Future Past. This is the home of Roger Dean, the artist who most successfully translated progressive rock's soundscapes into landscapes. He gave Yes their distinctive brand logo and imagined worlds that at the time still seemed like beautiful possibilities.
Whether you're designing just a box of matches, you're predicting one little teeny, minuscule part of the future. I think what's terribly astonishing and disappointing is how little of the promise of the future turned out. You know, in the 60s, people walked on the moon. In the 60s, there was colour television, you know, and no one has gone back to the moon. I think people would have been shocked if they could see the year 2008 from 1968 perspective, at how astonishingly little the world had improved compared to our ambitions and expectations. Had we planned it properly in the 60s, this is how it might have turned out. I try and find out what was motivating them to make the music and work on the same sort of ideas, if that was possible. It wasn't always possible, but sometimes it was. Sometimes there was a great synergy between the ideas that motivated the music making and the ideas that motivated the art. But it was not the music itself, it was the ideas behind it. I was lucky that the images and the music seemed to be an absolute perfect fit sometimes, when in actual fact the process was beyond analysis.
Yes, recording sessions were also moving beyond analysis. The hippie democracy the band chose as a way of life made for difficulties in the studio. Their fifth album, Close to the Edge, took over 3 months to perfect.
It took 3 months because Simon and Garfunkel had done Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which took 3 months. We heard this and we thought, well, by golly, our next record's going to take 3 months and a day if it kills us. So, of course, this is the infantile way we behave. We took 3 months and a day.
We established a whole new vein of length of how long we play. So, yeah, we've got some musicianship. We've got a lot of writers in the band, because Bill wrote, you know, everybody wrote in the band.
You know, can I trade your idea for my idea? You've got 5 guys writing imagine 5 guys writing a book.
Steve said, well, I've got this silly little line that I've had lying around for ages going ding 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 doo 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 dum dum dum.
It was all horse trading, muscle power, strongest guy, thickest skin.
And Chris said, I've got this bass run. And that was it, really. And I went, anything else? Is that? He went, no, that's it.
And when we got to what turned out to be, for me, the high spot, which was Close to the Edge, really, I don't know how that record got made.
Okay. Some days we got in the rehearsal room after, like, you know, yesterday, got in the next day and said, does anybody remember how we went from the last verse into that? No.
And say, well, I want that bit on the end of that, but I don't want to do it in that key because it works nicely the way I play it on guitar on that. So they'd go, oh, we'll have a cup of tea, Rick, you work out how we go from there to there.
We couldn't do a song in 5 minutes. It went to 10 minutes on the Yes album, and we got to Close to the Edge and we thought, oh, this just isn't long enough. We can't, this is like a symphony.
In those days, there were 2 or 3 albums which weren't so good, getting you towards the winner, the one that the thing existed for, which was Close to the Edge. That's the moment you exist for in a rock group, and it's terrific. And you think, that's the cookie, that's the one right there. Done deal. I'm gone. I left then.
Bruford defected to the less sunny, less democratic regime of Robert Fripp's all-new King Crimson. In 1972, this was akin to going over the Berlin Wall into East Germany. No papers required, just extreme chops.
If everything you've heard about King Crimson is true, it's an absolutely terrifying place. Whatever you do before you join King Crimson, would you please not do it when you're in the band? You're required really to develop a new style, if you can, specifically for that group. The implication being that you would play in that way in King Crimson and in King Crimson alone. And yes, it was an endless debate about should it be F natural in the bass with a G sharp on top from the organ, or should it be the other way around. In King Crimson, almost nothing was said. You're just supposed to know.
Robert Fripp was a purist. Unlike the Jimmy Pages of rock, he didn't brandish the guitar like a phallus. His was more like a probe, an instrument of science, not sex. And to use it properly, you had to sit down.
The very first few gigs we did, Robert didn't sit down. And he was very unhappy, because in rehearsals and everything, he'd have his stool and his thing, you know. That was how he'd been taught. And Robert's very strict about when Robert has them, how it should be, that's how it should be. And so eventually we just had to get him a stool because he was sulking. And he was so happy on that stool. And Robert's not a gyrator now, I see, you know. He may be many things, but he's not a gyrator. And Robert's idea of sexy is to smile with his glasses. And
Fripp wasn't alone. Sexual energy, the very lifeblood of rock and roll, was conspicuously absent from the prog rock stage. Bands like Egg had enough on their hands just playing the complicated arpeggios.
Well, we weren't very sexy, and we regarded overt sexual display as extremely uncool. It was something rather humiliating to have to admit to, that we were actually trying to get into girls' knickers. I mean, we wouldn't admit to it. It was very duplicitous, very dishonest, but there you are. We certainly wouldn't do it on stage. I would have been completely unconvincing. Imagine me doing sort of pelvic thrusts on stage while playing in 25/8. No.
No sex on stage, and no sex backstage. All the groupies were at Led Zeppelin concerts, not waiting for progressive rock maestros to demonstrate the delights of the diminished chord.
the rock bands in America had groupies. We didn't really have any, and the pop stars had groupies. We wanted groupies too.
We never had any Egg groupies. We never had any groupies, girl groupies at all. No girls ever came round to the side of the stage after the gig. Sad, isn't it? But
no, I don't know. When we went to America, we had lots of groupies, by the dozens, because they loved our English accents, and they loved we weren't sort of American rock stars. We were something different and exotic to them. Hey, I love your English accent. You'll want to take a shower with us? What? Both of you? Gosh.
Progressive rock audiences certainly weren't screamers. They were an infinitely patient lot. Too much yang, not enough yin.
What we started to realise was our audience are rather kind of nice and reserved people, you know.
You know, fishing hats, greatcoats, bunch of albums under the arm.
Public school sixth formers wearing greatcoats.
Ugly-looking audience, you know.
Pipe and glasses, yeah. Beards and stuff we used to have.
It was very male-orientated. I would say in those days 95% of our audience were male.
Never used to have females come to see us.
Not many girls, no. All chaps, you know.
Lots of guys, no girls.
What is this, some kind of homo band, or what is it?
There was the odd woman, mostly dragged along, who just used to look bewildered.
If the sexiness of 60s psychedelia was absent from the prog performance, theatricality, used so effectively by Arthur Brown, was becoming an essential part of any Genesis show.
A flower. Blue ball. Butterfly.
I mean, initially it started off really in many ways because the PA systems we had, you know, which was only the voice went through the PA in those days, were pretty bad, so you could never really hear any lyrics. And we had quite complex lyrics, and the lyrics was quite important. So Peter sort of felt he had to sort of act them out a bit, so he started acting it out a bit on stage.
The prog rock movement really stimulated the visual aspect as well as the playing and the conceptual side. The visual thing was now, theatre was important. Started with that kind of psychedelia period, Arthur Brown, wherever, and went on and got developed.
Progressive rock now had such a loyal male record-buying fan base that both the major and independent labels happily signed new bands and let them record whatever they wanted. They weren't even expected to make money at first. This was the age of company investment and artistic freedom. Egg recorded all their albums with zero interference.
They were interested in us because I think they thought we sounded a bit like the Nice, who had already had a chart hit, and they thought, well, you know, maybe these guys can make us some money, so they signed us up. But we had no input from them at all. I don't think we spoke to any Deccan executive ever.
I don't quite know why we got away with it, to be honest, you know, but that was the style then. I mean, we used to just, for some reason, we set the precedent that we'd make an album, when it's finished, we'd hand it over to the record label. I mean, how nice is that? You know, this is the album.
We were still allowed to do what we wanted to do by the record companies and management. We were still allowed to come up with ridiculous ideas and then somehow find people who could make it happen.
Until groups like Yes, a song was taken and played. The guitarist played the chords, the bass player played the roots, the drummer played the rhythm, and the singer sang the song. Yes said, no, we don't want to do it like that. We want to have a theme to start. We want to have a riff behind the song. We want to take out the chords of that section, because everybody's heard those before. Stick some lines in. More like an orchestral approach. You know, violins do this, the bassoon does that. You know, it's a bit like a thinking man's music, as opposed to a, you know, sort of like just from the gut music, you know, which rock was just really from the gut, I think.
Everybody was looking for, eagerly to see what was new, what was going to happen. And that was definitely a heady time, for sure, and one that I rather suspect we won't see again. 72, 73, we were in that kind of prog rock camp. Albeit we were the band that were making a joke of it. We were doing a bit of a send-up of prog rock for a couple of albums back then.
Despite Jethro Tull's determination to remain outside the prog rock establishment, their fourth album, Aqualung, seemed suspiciously profound.
It was not a concept album, but people just ignored it. This concept album, it's got a picture on... it's about God and stuff and tramps and things and concept, yeah. So in the wake of that, I just thought, well, let's give them the mother of all concept albums, let's have a bit of fun with the whole thing and do a sort of a spoof concept album and pretend it was written by a 12-year-old precocious schoolboy and do the ridiculously convoluted 16-page cover, which actually took longer to do than record the album, in fact. So it was a bit of a send-up. It was a pre-Spinal Tap moment.
But your new shoes are worn and the heels, and your suntan is rapidly healed, and your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick.
Ironically, the mischievous musical prank that was 1972's Thick as a Brick is now hailed as the ultimate progressive rock album. That same year, multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield was composing his progressive music masterwork, the near-scientific experiment that was Tubular Bells, for which he played all the 26 featured instruments himself.
Nightmare for me to try and explain to another musician how it should be played. I can't tell them, well, play it like I would play it, because they can't. I made my own notes, which only I could understand, so I did sort of map it out. as a kind of piece of classical music, but with the instruments that I could play. We were working in Abbey Road, and Paul McCartney was in the big studio next door, number 1, and somebody told me he was playing everything. And I understood from the technology we were using that you could overdub one instrument while listening to the rest. And I said, oh, well, he's probably doing it all like that. And I thought, well, I could do that with my one.
The album launched Virgin Records and was licensed in America with the help of an accompanying film put together for the BBC's Old Grey Whistle test. It went on to sell over 50 million copies worldwide.
Vintage footage, probably, you know, black and white era, late 20s, early 30s, of skiers pull out sort of a reel of film. And so let's look at this one. This one might fit, you know, with the snow going up, the powder, and ding 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 ding, and it was just beautiful.
That's incredible. Mike Oldfield, and just a part of Tubular Bells.
But commercial success and an underground reputation was still a contradiction. A shy Oldfield couldn't deal with the attention and took to the hills. The press, in pursuit of Britain's biggest international progressive music success story, were denied its star.
I left the human civilization and lived with my sheep on a little house on the Welsh border. I was having major psychological problems, kind of nervous breakdown kind of things, which wasn't very nice. Upset a hell of a lot of people. I mean, there was one journalist who was furious with me because I wouldn't go and do an interview. It was already so successful. What difference would it have made if I had, you know, done 500 interviews and toured the world? So I thought, well, what's wrong? What are you all bothering about? Just leave me alone.
If Oldfield rejected mainstream acceptance of his rarefied musical experiment, other musicians embraced the success that British progressive rock was now achieving around the world, most significantly in the States.
The Americans loved progressive rock. It was evidence of skill. Now, Americans, funnily enough, are a little unlike us in the sense that they are not immediately embarrassed by an overt display of capability.
The Americans, fantastic at doing that. Brits, crap. You know, the Brits come to a solo, well, I can actually play a lot better than this, but I won't because I don't want to show off, so I just do that and stand in the corner. Now, suddenly we're doing, hey, cop a load of this, you know.
Now let's bang the drum for somebody who 3 years running has been voted Drummer of the Year. He's just taken delivery of a new kit, and here he is to demonstrate it, Carl Palmer.
It was a stainless steel drum set. I was sponsored by British Steel.
8 different engineering companies were involved in the manufacture of this kit, which is the very first electronic stainless steel drum kit in existence.
I decided to get a jeweller using a dentist drill, a chap called Paul Raven, do these hunting scenes on each of the drums. I'd seen them on Purdy rifles and I was quite impressed.
There's a peacock, there's a beautiful squirrel, nibbling away there, there's a fox, really nice they are, and there's even somewhere I think a hedgehog, yes, there it is.
And they said, did you want the shells a 1/4 inch thick or 1/2 inch thick? And I said, what's the difference in the price? They said the same. I said, I'll have 1/2 inch. It was the 70s, excess, not thinking it would take 2 guys to lift the bass drum.
I know it weighs a couple of tons.
2.5 in actual fact.
And you're going to be travelling with this all around the world, you're going on tour next month,
Yes.
aren't you? How do you fly with it?
Very well, thank you.
The stage had to be reinforced. We didn't think of transport costs. We didn't think of, like, weight. It went on from there, decided to add the electronic drums, the very first electronic drums. At the time, everyone thought it was keyboards, but they were drums. Have it. It's the 70s, isn't it? You do. Bigger the better. If there was something that was available from a technology point of view that would enhance the sound of the band, we wanted it yesterday.
Progressive rock was now colonising the outer limits. In 1973, Yes had set sail on Topographic Oceans, a double album comprised of only 4 tracks, each packed with unusual sounds, key changes and time signatures.
And there was this constant question, could you hit this and it sounded good? You know, doing. We got slinkies and put mics on them and threw them downstairs and recorded them to hear what they like, you know. And you put a lot of reverb on, it's great. And it was. Yeah. It was that kind of insanity. It was a nice kind of insanity. It was a musical insanity.
Were totally self-indulgent.
But it was serious music. There was something more serious about Yes than some other bands at that time. We took ourselves a little serious. And our quest was to make something that we thought was kind of grand, not grandiose, but kind of had a grandeur about it, that had scale, but it had drama.
But this quest was even more arduous than the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. Audiences were showing signs of fatigue.
Robert had stopped King Crimson. Robert Fripp had stopped King Crimson around that time. Very prescient, very smart. I mean, I'd only just settled down. I just got my sticks out, you know, was just sort of settling in. But that's a bit like, that's life in King Crimson. It broke up at least 3 times, to my certain knowledge, probably several other times while I was in it.
If Fripp sensed an artistic cul-de-sac ahead when he put the brakes on King Crimson in 1974, others put their foot down and drove headlong into fame, fortune, and near-fatal solos.
These bands were, shockingly, to my mind, going on a transition away from the kind of honesty and real experimentalism that we were involved in, into a kind of unself-consciously show-busy way of doing things.
In the Genesis camp, Peter Gabriel's taste for the theatrical threatened to swamp the subtlety of the music, but enthusiastic audiences and an attentive press pushed the band closer to commercial success.
Americans particularly, you know, push past the rest of us and say, "Great show, Pete, great show. Boy, you were great tonight." And I just got fed up with it. So I've made my feelings known about that.
It sort of irritated us a bit that it got all the attention, but then we kind of knew that in the back of our minds, and we knew that obviously it gave us incredible publicity as well, so we weren't too sad about that side of it, really. I never had a particular problem. Perhaps once or twice in the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, you know, there were a couple of costumes that perhaps went too far. You couldn't really sort of, you know, you couldn't sing through them and stuff, but I always liked the visuals.
You know, it was all part of what we did, and nobody else was really doing it.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside.
ELP were busy establishing the power of British prog, conquering the 4 corners of the globe with tours built on showmanship. Technical extravaganzas light years away from underground clubs and hippie ideals.
You know, you have to say that by 75, 76, it all got overindulgent. It just all did.
So look at this. This is a Hilton, is it? From Conrad. Conrad, if you're looking in, look, one soft one, one hard one. What the use is that? What's that about?
I mean, I remember doing some filming with the ELP. They had 3 40-foot trucks. There was this moving ELP thing across it.
just seemed to me a betrayal. How could these people who are my heroes, how could Keith Emerson do that? There was no finesse to my mind, or sophistication, or kind of sensitivity about what they were doing at all. It was hysterical.
This whole stadium thing with Yes coming out of big petals that opened and stage design had almost begun now. There was a tipping point where the presentation, the stage design and everything else was almost taking over from the music in terms of the importance to the, and they were all outdoing each other.
What do you think? Progressive rock, the things you do, is overblown, it's pretentious, completely over the top and thoroughly pompous. What do you say to that? Say, yeah, you're about right, really.
Then some people came along who thought we could make this sexy, and you got Queen,
Mamma mia, mamma
who
mia.
had a lot of prog elements, but managed to get back to having tunes and just devastating emotional climaxes instead of intellectual doodlings.
When Peter Gabriel left Genesis in 1975 to go solo, grammar school interloper Phil Collins became the frontman for the Charterhouse Boys. A new Genesis became even more successful with Trick of the Tail, an album that seemed to sniff an approaching storm in its return to simpler songs.
Am I wrong to believe in the city of gold? It lies in the distance, crying where's the land? No way to engage. He's the guitar with the sign.
Some of the things that were, became very simplified in some people's, or shortened or commercialized is the dirty word. They kind of think that was my fault, And I won't take the glory or the blame for any of that. There are certain songs that people always put down, that's a Phil song.
After Peter left, you're kind of conscious that, do you carry on doing what you've always done? These long half-hour pieces or concert albums, you kind of think maybe you've done that a bit, and you move on a bit.
What's this song called? It's not a song, Stubbs. It's the first movement of a rock symphony. Apotheosis of the Necromancer.
Oh, that's a dead cert for Top of the Pops. Rick Wakeman might be your god, but let me tell you something. Concept albums are out.
There's a scene in the Rotters Club where the school band morphs from being a progressive band to a punk band in mid-song.
It's a big explosion of resentment against the highbrows. What they were saying was, this glam rock and this progressive rock is not communicating to me, and I feel marginalised.
I didn't think it was us that they were talking about, yeah, okay, we could, let's lose the guys that go, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that lot.
What I didn't like was the great hate that those people pretended to have for the establishment of rock bands at that particular point. Anybody that played something, a bit more complex or a bit interesting in that was all out of the window.
Another girl in the neighborhood.
On the one hand, I liked it because it was trashing things, but on the other hand, I didn't like it because it was a kind of return to infancy. Yeah, I mean, there's this permanent tension, isn't there, in rock music between the three chords and the truth merchants. 4/4 and 3 chords. And the other people, like me, who say, well, what if we added a 4th chord and put it in 5/4? There's always people like me messing up what these people think is pop music.
Well, pretty good bands came out of punk, but they were excellent writers and excellent musicians. But that wasn't really what punk was all about. Punk was all about not being musical, you know. And of course, British Isles was the only country that fell for it, you know. They didn't manage to do it anywhere else.
One of the things that proper musicians objected to with punk was that they were always out of tune, the punk bands. Whereas if you listen to Schoenberg and Cecil Taylor, there's no such thing as out of tune. It's just another bunch of notes. In fact, if you're going to play the same 3 rock and roll chords, instead of like learning all kind of fancy ones, why not just play the guitar out of tune? That'll give you something different. I thought that was a kind of very lovely homemade solution to harmonic inventiveness. Just don't tune up, you know. Don't sing in tune. How far out can you get, you know? The notes between the notes. We're hitting them.
The next generation had arrived, determined to overthrow Daddy in the archetypal Oedipal battle for supremacy. Only this time, Daddy was a prog rocker.
You initially grow up with the music that the generation before you, that your parents have chosen, and you don't want it. My mum and dad used to listen to Pearl and Teddy Johnson.
Darling, darling, sweet Elizabeth, say you'll be mine, hey, always be mine.
I didn't want to listen to bloody Pearl and Teddy Johnson, so along comes The Who and bands like that. Yeah, absolutely, that's what I want. And it belongs to you. I mean, prog rock, to some extent, killed the pop bands. The pop bands killed the crooner. Punk killed prog rock.
The landscape of 70s Britain bore no resemblance to the imagined mystical worlds of prog rock and Roger Dean. It was plagued by shortages, strikes, and post-60s disillusionment. In 1979, an Iron Lady would be crowned Queen in the court of the Crimson King.
Lyrically, progressive music in the 70s was very divorced from social reality. Completely divorced, and just not interested in it, really. But lyrics are always a problem in this kind of music, I think, because it is about music. It's about doing interesting things with instruments, I think, and making interesting musical shapes and landscapes. But if you're going to have a singer, then what's he going to sing about? Often the solution was to go down the Tolkien, Roger Dean route and to sing about fantasy worlds and so on, and that, there's a kind of embarrassment about that now, which I certainly share.
Genesis missed the British punk revolution. Like many progressive bands, they were too busy being successful abroad. On their return, they not only weathered the punk front, now sitting firmly over the country, but perversely enjoyed an Indian summer.
We were kind of unaware of punk, really, because we were up travelling, touring so much. We were not really aware of anything else that was going on. And all we knew that really the groups like sort of Yes and ELP and everything had sort of disappeared a bit. So that left, in a sense, we were the last ones left standing. So we picked up everybody else's audience, is the way I look at it. But I don't know. I mean, I think we always had that side to us which was based more on the songwriting, perhaps, than on the playing. And that perhaps carried us through.
Along with you, I will follow you. Follow me, the days and nights that we know will be. I will stay with you, stay with me, just one single cheering.
We started having hit singles. I mean, with Follow You, Follow Me opened a big door for us. It was the first time we'd been played on English radio, and it was a reasonable hit. It wasn't massive. But after that, we were able to put out singles, and they would always get played for many years. However, and then a lot of them did quite well. So suddenly that meant that the potential audience became much bigger.
Most bands weren't so lucky. Procol Harum's 10th album, Something Magic, an ambitious concept in which their instruments played characters in a story that was narrated, not even sung, became their swan song.
We'd finished it. I don't know how we managed to record this thing. And then we turn around and there it is, all, of course, punks, and the way we left it up was just to sort of pack up on our last night of a tour in America, we said, that's it then. And we all went our separate ways.
In the 1980s, original King Crimson lyricist Pete Sinfield uncovered a secret path into pop music as a writer of chart-topping hits.
Nasty in your garden's waiting patiently till it can have your heart.
Try to write something that a lot of people are going to like very quickly, and yet still trying to get something of you in it. Something nasty in your garden waiting till it will steal your heart, which for me is like a King Crimson line. So I've just taken it into a different setting.
King Crimson itself staged several comebacks, and its 1974 album Red would in time influence grunge guru Kurt Cobain.
Somewhere in 1987, I probably gave up noisy rock. I mean, there was the odd reunion tour, but in my mind I was redefined as a jazz musician, which I probably should have been in the first place.
Yes teamed up with hip 80s producer Trevor Horn, who helped tune their songs to the ears of a very different decade. But the expedition to the far reaches of pop music that left base camp in the late 60s was by now lost, forgotten, or only spoken of in hushed tones.
Prog had become a really dirty word, you know, it's the sort of thing that you didn't mention in public.
It's almost the only kind of music where people will write off everything that's in the genre, without embarrassment actually, and just say, you know, it's all shit.
You know, people would go to a record store and sort of say, I'd like some couple of country and western, there's some you know, a bit of new age, a bit of modern romantic, please, as well. A couple of punk, I've got Stranglers, I love that, thank you very much. A bit of classical and
But there were people out there that might not have liked Yes, but liked a bit of Genesis. Might not have liked the Floyd, but liked a bit of Jethro Tull.
Yes, so hold up. I'll do it under the counter. And they do it under the counter in a brown paper bag and hold it round the side. You know, it was like the porn of the music industry.
I went out and bought the first Sex Pistols album, and didn't mind telling people that I had and that I listened to it. Whereas Johnny Rotten at the time would never admit to having listened to Jethro Tull, but many, many, many years later admitted that that one of his sort of seminal influences was the Aqualung album.
I met Rat Scabies in an airport. We're about to get on a plane, and he came up to me and he said, I just want you to know I'm a big fan of yours. But, you know, you just want to make sure that nobody was looking.
We were living a dream, you know, but it would be stupid for people to keep thinking that life was easy because you're living a dream. It's not easy. It's a lot of hard work, and these lines on my face are evidence. The lost chord. You're always looking for that thing that you haven't heard yet.
Not everyone persevered in the land of make-believe. There had been early casualties.
The reason I stopped doing it rather suddenly was simply because of my dependent psychology. I needed praise, and I wasn't getting any. It was a bit like a child that dies aged 3 of malnutrition. You know, it gets born, there's all sorts of hope and good expectations. It learns to walk, it learns to run, it learns to talk, and then suddenly it gives up because it didn't get enough nourishment. It was like that for me.
At its purest, progressive rock wasn't about money, celebrity, record contracts, or the audience. It wasn't even a type of music, it was a belief, a value system of the early 70s, one that now seems like old-time religion. Its creators, often precocious, sometimes indulged, occasionally deluded, but always uncompromising, baptized the decade with a soundtrack of stark virtuosity, weird time signatures, strange poetry, and surprising beauty. The musical experiment now labelled prog rock and stored under the counter, or placed almost out of reach on the top shelf.
It grew out of rock music, and that's why it was written about in the rock press. But it's kind of a shame that it ever became regarded as part of rock and roll, because it's not. I think the ethos is completely different, and if you judge it by the standards of rock and roll, then it fails. It's actually a bunch of very talented musicians who were kind of cursed with very musically intelligent brains, really, who got bored very quickly with playing 3 chords all the time and wanted to do stuff which was more complex and more challenging.